Hello, hello. My name is Gabriel Fairman. I'm the founder and CEO of BureauWorks, and today I'm going to be addressing why industry leaders are rapidly adopting cloud-based translation management systems. Well, let's start from the beginning, right? What's the opposite or what's different from cloud-based translation management systems? Those would be desktop and servers, right? And without getting too philosophical about it, right? When we talk about a desktop application, we're talking about software that must be downloaded, must be installed locally on the machine, must be ran and maintained on that machine, and must be updated on that machine. When we compare that with cloud-based applications, we immediately notice a lot of differences. Number one, when we talk about a cloud-based system, you don't have to worry about updating that system that you're using because typically updates are kept continuously. So you're always working on the latest version of the software, right? So you don't depend on the user or an IT manager to download an upgrade patch or and upgrade that manually within that machine. You can imagine the ripple effect if you have, for instance, 10 users, 50 users, 500 users in an organization that creates from a maintenance and overhead perspective. If every time there's a major or even minor update, that will require some kind of manual action on behalf of the user or the IT manager to certify that that upgrade or update has been implemented. So there's a immediate difficulty in maintaining all of the different softwares that are running within the latest versioning and control. So what this typically will create is that you'll have different users running on different versions of the same software, which is really hard to manage because a lot of these versions have completely different functionalities to them. And pretty soon you have a scenario where you have users that are running on theoretically the same software, but they don't have access to the same features that other users do, which makes managing, training, and keeping people on the same page really, really hard, right? You're also talking about complications at the machine level. So, for instance, you're talking about applications that are typically going to consume significant computing power, either processing power, RAM, disk space. You're talking about something that's locally installed as compared to a web application that's typically heavy loaded on the front end, very light loaded on the back end, which minimizes the computing requirements that you need. Sure, you have the downside that you do require an internet connection, a stable and typically fast internet connection for a good experience. But we're moving into a 5G world, and it's 2024. I would say it's less common than more common for people not to have access to those kinds of connections, particularly because work in general is migrating to a cloud-based operation in the sense that even if you want to perform a Google search, whether or not that seems apparent to you, that's also a cloud-based operation as far as how the computing power for Google is structured, right? So even when you're performing what seems like a very simple operation, like a search, you're actually using cloud computing. So the difference between cloud is working with desktop and servers. The difference is that desktop and servers are very heavy on maintenance, very heavy on individual users, very heavy on computing power, very hard to standardize as opposed to cloud-based. So with cloud-based, you get also a lot more transparency typically in pricing because let's say you're paying for a subscription, you know that that subscription is going to cover any potential upgrade to the software compared to, for instance, if you're paying for software, maybe you're paying for the software, but maybe you're going to have to pay a separate fee for upgrades and maintenance, and maybe you're going to have to purchase even significant upgrades separately. So it creates maybe less, you have less of an overhead from a monthly cost, but you also have less predictability as far as yearly costs and what that's going to represent for your company. So cloud-based, in my opinion, and in the direction that the industry has been taking is the prevailing way in which translation management systems are being implemented and introduced. So when we talk about why people adopt these reasons, we're talking about flexibility, we're talking about scalability, we're talking about security. We addressed some of these already in this very quick introduction. Let's talk about security too, right? When you're talking about a locally implemented software, you have less governance over how that software was installed, what kinds of things are running locally on that machine that could compromise the integrity of that software. and so on. When you're talking cloud-based, you have a lot more control at all levels, including governance, security over what's going on with that given application. We also address typically the motivation around scalability, for instance, right? If the more users you have, the harder it becomes to maintain everybody in the same version of any given software, right? So how does this translate, pun intended, into translation management systems, right? When you talk about translation management systems, you're typically talking about a significantly large group of people working together, right? Let's say you have an agency, and even for a relatively small agency with 10 project managers, maybe they have 100 different translators working on those translations. Those would be, let's say, and maybe another 10 people in management, finance. We're talking about 120 people working together, collaborating within the same software. If people are running different versions of that software for any given reason, it becomes really, really hard to maintain the overall integrity of that operation. If everybody is working on the same cloud-based system, much simpler to maintain that. The other thing, you get a lot of benefits because the information is all stored in a centralized repository. It's a lot easier to achieve certain critical features. For instance, being able to have live tracking of project progress. Everything is being maintained within the same environment. Sure, you could replicate that with servers and things like that, but when you're talking about servers, then again, you're talking about a lot of management to maintain that server, to have to pay for a very stable and very fast internet connection for that server. You're talking about all the traffic going into that server. You're talking about creating fail safes and redundancies and backups for that server. There's a lot of engineering that goes into creating the structure of modern cloud computing. Let's say that's done in AWS or Azure. Is it possible to replicate? Yes. Could it be even sometimes penny for penny as expensive or a little bit less expensive to run your own server? Sure. But when you look at the overall cost and the impact in the overall ecosystem that you're managing, then typically cloud computing will be an undeniable winner. So when we talk about the positive impacts of cloud computing in translation management, we're talking about things that I mentioned. For instance, you can monitor project progress in runtime. You're no longer sending files up and down via email files because they're in a centralized repository. It's all about permissions and accessibility. If you make a given file accessible to a given user, and they have the permissions to see that or see that project, they'll be able to work on it without without a package, for instance, having to be sent manually to them, having them download that package. And again, we get into security implications as well, because let's say you're running in the governance of whatever cloud management system that you're using, and let's say, for instance, that cloud system stores information encrypted at rest and transmits information also encrypted in transit using TLS 1.2 or similar standards. You're talking about a lot of governance over how this information is transmitted. If you're talking about information being transmitted over email, for instance, that governance is definitely not going to be the same, right? You're going to have maybe some people are going to send a file over WhatsApp. Maybe people are going to send a file over email. Is that email going to be encrypted? Could that email be sent potentially to the wrong sender? There's so many different possibilities for emails being compromised. And traditionally, right, the more information you leave at the discretion of an individual user, the greater the probability of erratic behavior from that user. The greater the number of users, the greater the probability of any given disaster taking place, as opposed to centralized governance where you have a given set of security behaviors and practices that are controllable, manageable, scalable, and so on. So when we talk about also impact in translation quality, for instance, when you centralize all of this information, there's a lot that can be done by it, because now you're no longer talking about things being decided individually. You're talking about this intelligence that's being collected in a very centralized way, that can be governed in a very centralized way, and can be best put to use in a way that really benefits those translation agencies. We're talking about reduction in overhead. We're talking about reducing time to market. We're talking about increasing translation margins. We're talking about increasing translation quality, right? And when we talk about examples of major companies that already operate with cloud-based TMSs, we're talking about basically all big market leaders that we know, companies like Uber, companies like Airbnb, companies like Cloudflare, companies like Harley Davidson. These are all examples of companies that work with cloud-based transition management systems. Now, the other thing is that now that we're talking about artificial intelligence and all this continuous buildup to the tech stack that's available in translation management systems, this becomes incrementally harder if you're working with desktop or server-based applications, because now we're talking about even more significant upgrades that need to be updated in that individual software, as opposed to when you're talking about a cloud-based application. If it's well structured, if it's well architected, and if it has a microservice architecture with APIs and multiple endpoints, it's fairly simple from an engineering perspective to plug in additional services and additional configurations and workflow possibilities for any given file. Again, when you're working in a desktop or server environment, you're going to have to regenerate potentially a very different version of that software and update it and install it and configure it and train people on it so that they can perform those same kinds of tasks. So when we're talking about what to expect for the next years in cloud-based computing, we should likely expect a much greater level of adoption of cloud-based computing. And in my personal opinion, companies that are not running translation management systems that are cloud-based are going to be so far behind that they will become obsolete. It's going to be so impossible. The criteria for what efficiency means is going to increase by several orders of magnitude, in my personal opinion. So for instance, right now, maybe the expectation is that the translation is requested, maybe a few hours later you get the quote and a really efficient operation. Maybe it's going to be next day. Maybe someone signs off on the quote. The project manager is going to get the files. They're going to prepare the kits. They're going to send out files. Translators are going to get them. They're going to run them in their desktop applications. They're going to create packages. They're going to send the packages out again to the agencies. The agencies are going to rebuild them. We're talking about like a multi-day, sometimes even weeks process to create a translation cycle. With the advent of GPT-4 and other large language models that have the possibility of making the translation process incredibly more effective from, for instance, an edit distance perspective, the expectation is going to be, well, I have a translation and I want it now. And I want it now, and I want it seen by someone who's an expert in that particular field, in that particular country. And I want that to happen very, very quickly. So whatever the expectation was to happen in the matter of days or weeks is now going to be shortened to a matter of minutes and hours. So in order to make that exchange possible, the only way, in my opinion, is if you have a high degree of automation that's only enabled by cloud-based translation management systems. But those are my thoughts. Would love to hear yours in the comments. Thank you so much for listening. Please remember to like and subscribe if you like this video. And this is Gabriel signing off. Till next time. Bye-bye.